This is a FarmDoc Daily Webinar. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason with Illinois Public Media and at willag.org. That's willag.org online, bringing you radio broadcasts and agricultural information and news each and every day. Today, we're going to talk about fertilizers and fuel risk as a result of the Iran conflict with the FarmDoc team and some special guests. We're joined by Gary Schnitkey, of course, here in studio. Gary, an agricultural economist, along with Nick Paulson at the University of Illinois, and Chuck Spencer and Gretchen Kuck are here. And we may be joined by Jim Raftis over time. He is with the Illinois Department of Agriculture. Nick, thank you for organizing this and helping to make sure that we're set to talk about what's been happening in the Middle East and its impact, I know, on agriculture and what that means for fertilizer and fuel prices now and in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Todd, for the introduction, as always. Again, we'll introduce our guests here and then get started. So we'll start with Chuck Spencer. He's the Executive Director of Government Relations for GROWMARK and the FS Cooperatives. Prior to his time with GROWMARK, Chuck also had roles in state and national legislation, farm policy with the Illinois Farm Bureau. And he is also a proud U of I alum, or we hope he's a proud U of I alum. Gretchen is out in D.C., or sitting in D.C. right now. She's the D.C. economist for the National Corn Growers Association. Been in D.C. with some roles prior to her current role for about 4 years, I guess, at this point. Gretchen is a proud Texan. We will try not to hold that against her. And she earned her undergrad degree at Texas A&M, but then came up here and, as she said, did her time in the Midwest and worked on her master's degree with Gary Schnitkey, actually, here in Ag Econ at the University of Illinois. And we enjoyed having Gretchen in the program and continuing to work with her since then. And then if Jim is able to join us, Jim Raftis is an ag market reporter for the Illinois Department of Agriculture. He's also a fourth-generation farmer and has served as a consultant to row crop and small grain producers across North America prior to his current role with the Illinois Department of Ag. Hopefully Jim can join us because I think he plays a role, or I know he plays a role in putting together some of the data we're going to be taking a look at over the next few minutes. That comes from the Illinois Production Cost Report. As well as the daily Illinois Grain Report that comes out of the work that he and his colleagues do in that market news department with the Illinois Department of Ag. So we appreciate that. So what we're planning on doing today, this is going to be maybe a little bit different than a standard webinar where Gary and I might just present and kind of talk to the group for most of the time. We are going to have a little bit of that on the front end here. Try and keep 10 minutes to 15 minutes and just kind of provide some of the context in terms of what we've seen with fertilizer and fuel price movements over what is now close to a month since the conflict in Iran began. We'll talk a little bit about what we see as possible or potential impacts on the 2026 crop year. And then I think most of us agree maybe more concerning or more impactful, kind of looking ahead as to what this might mean for 2027 or even beyond. And we've got our guests who are going to provide some commentary. And then hopefully we'll leave half the time to open it up for some questions that we can kind of address in kind of a panel or a roundtable format. And so, I'm sure most of the attendees on the webinar have been following this. It's been hard to miss if you follow any news in the popular press. But the conflict in Iran, Operation Epic Fury, did officially begin on Saturday, February 28th. And that region of the world is a major energy and fertilizer exporter. So obviously oil and gas, and then on the fertilizer side, a big exporter, a big player in the global export market for urea and ammonia, and also phosphates and sulfur, which is a big ingredient that goes into producing some of those phosphate fertilizer products that farmers use across the world. It is an area that's actually highly dependent on agricultural imports, so it's not an ag exporter. We'll talk about, I think, some of the distinctions we think that creates when we might want to compare how this international conflict might impact agricultural markets relative to what we saw as part of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that broke out in February of 2022. And then, I think a lot of us have learned more than we used to know about the Strait of Hormuz, just because that is a shipping channel that carries a significant portion of these energy and fertilizer products that go out to the world from that Persian Gulf region there that you see in the background map. And so what we're going to do, and Jim was able to join us. Thanks, Jim. We gave you an introduction before you were able to hop on. But Gary and I are going to walk through sort of what we're seeing in some of the data sources that we track related to fertilizer and fuel prices. And then I think provide a little commentary again on what we think the impact of this might be for the 2026 crop year and looking ahead to 2027 in terms of farmer returns. And so the first one we're going to take a look at here, and this specifically is data that comes from the biweekly Illinois production cost report that we mentioned that Jim and his team is involved with putting together every 2 weeks and reporting on out of that Illinois Department of Ag. And we have seen an increase in anhydrous ammonia. And here it is a bi-weekly report. So the latest report is as of Friday, March 20th. So the price changes that we're looking at here, that $155 increase to that close to $1,000 per ton, $1,000 per ton level, 18.4% is over that month period from February 20th to March 20th. So trying to do our best here to capture kind of a pre-conflict to current price level change there in those numbers. So again, this is anhydrous ammonia. Another source that we're able to track here is we do in the department have access to a Bloomberg terminal, and Green Markets provides some daily fertilizer prices at various locations around the world. Just as a comparison, because we were able to update this through yesterday, March 25th, we do see, again, increases relative to the start of the conflict on the order of about 15% if we're looking at Corn Belt locations for anhydrous ammonia prices, a higher relative increase in the Middle East, closer to a 20% increase over that time frame from pre-conflict on Friday, February 27th to yesterday, Wednesday, March 25th.
Just a couple other notes here. Nitrogen prices or anhydrous ammonia were edging up before the conflict, so we saw those rising. And we still don't, fortunately, or had those at the $1,200 level like the previous conflict. And by the way, the previous conflict, we were seeing nitrogen prices rise because of Hurricane Ida well before the the Ukraine-Russia event happened.
All right. The other one that I think has been a lot in the news because it is one of the main products that comes out of that Middle East region in terms of nitrogen fertilizer types, and that is urea. Urea here, again, this is back to the Illinois production cost report data that is bi-weekly. So from February 20th to March 20th, we saw an increase in Illinois urea prices on the order of $240 plus dollars for over a 41% increase on those, up to that $822.50 you see from the March 20th report. And then again, if we compare that to the more current and daily data that comes from that Bloomberg terminal, about a 38% increase in terms of U.S. Corn Belt urea prices versus a 51% increase in the Middle East, again, measuring that from February 27th to March 15th. So you can see the relative price increases on both of those nitrogen types bigger in the Middle East, but sizable increases also impacting us here in the Midwest and Corn Belt region.
And that probably is due to the fact that we do have a sizable nitrogen production capability here in the U.S. and produce 80% of our nitrogen here within the U.S.
All right, and Jim, we had talked a little bit as we were getting ready for this webinar. You're obviously highly involved with those Illinois production cost report numbers that come out every 2 weeks. Is there anything we should know about sort of the process with which that data is put together? Anything that you saw particularly in the first two reports in March. Anything we should expect in the next report that we'll have in about a week in terms of those Illinois numbers?
One thing that we did notice, it seemed that the bids coming in from the retailers in the southern part of the state were just a little bit higher. That's and the northern half, say I-72 into northern Illinois, pretty static. So we're seeing a lot of movement in the south. We're seeing a lot of steady runs in the northern, if you would, mid-central to the north-central part of the state. So, and I can't really put my finger on why that is, but I think that's probably something we're going to continue to see. I've noticed that as I've gone back into the data from about the last 15 years, it seems like all of a sudden Southern Illinois spikes, downstate Illinois spikes anyway, and then the northern part of the state kind of follows in line with that. So that's kind of what I've seen over the past couple of days.
And then anecdotally, I think things we'd heard too were, maybe, and I don't know if part of the process you hear stories like this, but in terms of, the length of time, number of days, bids folks might be getting from their retailers, how long those might be good for. There seemed to be a pretty big change that occurred over that first weekend, last weekend of February, first weekend of March there when the conflict started, bids that maybe you received at the end of that last week of February, we're not good anymore the following week. And it kind of went to a daily, check back daily to see kind of what was available there for pricing opportunities.
Yeah, it certainly did. And, going back into the data again, back in 2008, we had a big nitrogen spike. And October 21st, we were about the same level we are right now, $850 to $1,200 for anhydrous ammonia. That next week, we were at $1,400, then $1,500, $1,600. It just kept climbing, but then it fell back about the same rate that it climbed. The October 20th of 2021, same deal. We were at $850 to $1,250 in about a week and a half time. So this is not necessarily a phenomenon. It's shocking to see when it happens as quickly as it's happening now, but we've seen it before.
All right, thanks, Jim. And then I think kind of getting to the what's the impact at the farm level. This figure on the screen now comes from an article we just put out on FarmDoc this week. I think it was posted Tuesday evening. Maybe wouldn't have seen it until Wednesday. But Gary has been involved in kind of working with a relatively simple forecasting model for anhydrous ammonia prices in Illinois, and we kind of updated that this week. I think what that would suggest is something that I think all of us would expect is we should, even if the conflict was wrapped up here in the next couple of days, these higher prices tend to be persistent, and we should be kind of expecting a higher nitrogen price heading into the pricing period for the 2027 crop here in the fall. And that $860 number forecast that you see there, I think we talk about that in the article. That I don't want to say that's a best case scenario, but I think there's even a pretty good chance that we'd see premiums above that, just given kind of what we saw in really the 2 years following that Russia-Ukraine crisis. We did see some premiums above what you would maybe expect, given where corn and natural gas prices were, which is kind of what this model uses to forecast premiums above kind of those maybe fundamental levels that extended into the fall of 2022 and again into the fall of 23. You can see those labeled on the screen there. So close to $100 in 22, $80 in 23. And so we could expect, easily, I think, potentially $1,000 anhydrous prices in the fall, particularly if the conflict continues. Gary, you have anything to add?
No,
there?
just that's going to make a difficult decision environment because many farmers often price their ingredients then, and we'll see where prices are at that point in time. But, continuation of current prices would make the economics of growing corn in particular a bit more difficult.
Yep. And then nitrogen, again, has been the big story. We got just another type here that's tracked in that biweekly production cost report for Illinois. 12% increase in 28% solution, up to $4.89 on March 20th. That's up over $50 from the February 20th report. And then we also are seeing increases that didn't start necessarily at the end of February. As Gary pointed out, we saw fertilizer prices. They've been kind of creeping up since early part of 2025 for most products here that are tracked. But maybe a heightened increase here around the conflict starting at the end of February. So we see DAP here, and then in the next slide we've got our MAP prices up closer to 4% from that February 20th to March 20th time period, over a $30 increase to nearly $900 per ton for MAP across the state. Potash is another one we look at here. So again, not necessarily reliant in any meaningful way on the Middle East for this. We're highly reliant on imports, but virtually all of it, or the vast majority of our potash imports, come from Canada. But a 2.3% increase on that over that month from February 20th to March 20th. Just over $500 per ton in the latest Illinois report there. And then, kind of shifting to the diesel fuel story here. And I think this is one that could have more wide-ranging implications, even though it's, as Todd mentioned at the start of the webinar, not a huge cost component in budgets directly for diesel fuel, but obviously high fuel prices tend to impact everything. And the longer high fuel prices hang around, the higher the cost of all inputs could be as we look ahead towards 2027. But sizable increases in diesel fuel prices here, almost 35% increase in that average Illinois price from February 20th to March 20th. And if we look at some of the other indicators we have that are even updated since March 20th on diesel, I would expect this number in the next Illinois production cost report to probably creep up closer to that $5 per gallon number as increases have continued, and sort of looking around at some other more current sources of information there.
Yeah, and if you're looking at fertilizers, even though they're creeping up, many farms have already purchased their fertilizer. That's probably less so for diesel fuel, depending on probably the stocks are there already for most of the planting season, but the harvest season probably is not locked in on many farms.
Yeah, so I think that's a good transition in terms of sort of talking about, so what are the impacts here that we expect to see? As Gary said it, and we've written about this in a few articles in the last few weeks on FarmDoc, and I know Gretchen's done some work that they've put out through National Corn. All of us have been, living fertilizer. It's been the main area of focus for all of us and what we do since the beginning of March. And I think, again, the silver lining here is that the impact on 2026 production costs will be, I don't want to say small, but smaller than it would have been had this occurred, 6 months earlier. As Gary said, I think a lot of farmers have, booked and maybe even applied a good share of their nitrogen in the fall. And even anything that's remaining for spring applications could have been priced ahead of some of these increases. There will be individual situations where farms had, larger percentages of their nitrogen needs not priced and are more exposed to some of the higher prices that we've seen. But I think overall, if we look at averages, the bigger potential impact will be as we look ahead to the 2027 crop. Again, particularly if some of these fuel cost increases translate into inflationary effects on inputs more broadly, even outside of nitrogen and other fertilizer products.
Yep, and again, general round of inflation. The other impact that likely is going to happen is we're increasing federal spending, so we will have probably an impact, particularly on longer-term interest rates, as more demands for funding is met through treasury markets.
Yeah, so I think now we want to give our guests some time to chime in with maybe some of the highlights that they've seen as the most pressing issues. I guess we didn't really draw straws to see who would go first, so we'll pick on Chuck since he just smiled at that comment, and we'll kind of give him the floor for a few minutes to touch on a few things.
Yeah, really appreciate it and being part of the panel today, and thought I'd start off with a little bit of the commentary, as you pointed out. And GROWMARK and FS Cooperatives, we're a farmer-owned cooperative system serving North America. Our farmer owners are continually focused on how their cooperative system can help them in their in-field profitability. The topics you've already introduced are something that we hear on a continuum right now. And particularly, we've noticed in talking with our energy and fertilizer teams in preparation for this, but then we actually in government relations in our system meet on a weekly basis with them because they're meeting weekly in this time frame of planting season in the Northern Hemisphere upon us. And anything that the administration is saying has an impact in the marketplace pretty immediately. Now, I'm not saying that's long term, but you'll notice that today there's movement negative in stocks for the moment. Energy prices are going up because Iran had supposedly declined their 15-point plan and has a plan of their own. We could go moment by moment with those types of updates, but it shows you the sensitivity in my perspective from a policy-making team. What our team does is we work with state, provincial, and federal levels of government in the U.S. and Canada. So we've talked about energy and fertilizer for quite some time, and particularly as it continues with the Iran escalation of conflict here. And I know that we hear it at farmers, field level. We also talk about it in a continuum in the halls of capitals across many of the countries in which we're involved in, where we talk about the policies that could be impactful to farmers and be helpful for their ag economy. We also note that there is strong global competition for agriculture supplies, and that's something that I think is worthy of discussing, because what we see is that the United States and North America as a whole tend to be some of the lowest bidding countries for fertilizer products out there in the global marketplace that our system sees. And that's something that I think we kind of forget. And we get products like sulfur through the Strait of Hormuz, 50% can go through there. You need sulfur for creating sulfuric acid to process phosphorus. And so that's something that's really, really important that we keep thought of. To farmers was kicked out earlier this year. There's discussion of reconciliation. Of course, our agriculture leaders in the House and Senate are discussing whether they want to put forward another assistance package to farmers in the U.S. We'll see if that happens. We got early word that 15% blending levels for ethanol or E15 nationwide, which is a very good signal. It was anticipated, though, in many markets that we would be seeing that, but we heard the announcement yesterday, which is good. And I think one of the things that we have also watched and been very focused on is trade agreements. And you may say, wait a second, the United States is applying tariffs to everyone. But what we have found very, very valuable is that the trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and of course the reauthorization, if you're a Canadian, it's CUSMA, USA, it's USMCA, and Mexico has their country first in that abbreviations for the trade agreements. But what's important is the free flow of fertilizer without tariffs. And when we think of input prices, and as Jim is pointing out, and I'm sure Gretchen will touch on as well, we do not need additional costs in putting into our system. And that's something where you see the trade agreement being so valued. And that's another thing policy-wise we've got to talk to members of Congress, members of Parliament, that we need to make sure that we renew the trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Is going to be important. We also discuss transportation bottlenecks and what this has done. I mean, we've just talked about the Strait of Hormuz and where that tightness does exist. One of the things that our system sees, though, is that we can, for the spring of 26, get fertilizer to where it's needed. I am not saying that the people who want to apply fertilizer are comfortable with the price. There's certainly markets where there's tightness, and the East Coast, you may have to go to Indiana, Ohio, Georgia to get a supply, which some people may say we're not doing that, but we can get supply for most of the places that need it and have demanded it. So we're obviously going to be hopeful that the next 45 days puts a good planting season here in the Midwest or the United States, and we'll continue to be very engaged in the policy process as well as listening to the updates Team FarmDoc has and so many of the other colleagues here on the seminar today. So thank you for that open.
Thanks, Chuck. We'll give the floor to Gretchen now, maybe hear a little bit from the national corn perspective.
Chuck, you just won major brownie points by talking about how important USMCA is. So thank you for starting us on that. Howdy, guys. Thrilled to be here today. Like Nick said, it has been fertilizer 24/7 since the beginning of the month. It's something that is top of our farmers' minds, top of policymakers' minds. And I have been talking a lot, especially from my spot in DC. I talk with a lot of folks that maybe don't have ag experience or don't know the technicalities of what's here. And so do a lot of perspective building about where we're at, what this means, where we're at in history too, on that timeline of what this means for farmers. And, something I tell them is I think, if you had asked me in February or December what, one of my biggest concerns was for farmer profitability, I probably would have already told you fertilizer. This is not a new idea. This is not a new concept. As far back as September, we had a survey of growers saying up to 40% were planning to reduce fertilizer applications to weather some of these economic conditions. We already had a really interesting year in fertilizer markets leading up to this crisis. You had elevated high prices that we've had since 2020. You've had, we're heading into our fourth year of projected negative returns for corn growers, which makes it really hard to cash flow some of those increased, really high production costs. And you're having farmers having to make a lot of really tough decisions already. Maybe we're hoping for prices to come down and hadn't bought, but you've had U.S. tariffs rerouting some supply chains. You've had restrictions from China on phosphate. You've had countervailing duties on phosphate. So it's been a really complicated year already. And this is not really a new idea that farmers are concerned about high fertilizer prices. And so, like I said, I do a lot of perspective building in DC, right? And so most of the other folks, they know that 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was a spike in high prices. That's kind of their benchmark for what they understand is happening right now. And they ask, is this similar? Is this worse? Is this better? Like how much is your hair on fire? What alarm are you at? And, they say, looking at the graph, if we're looking at a NOLA urea contract, that's $700-ish right now compared to $1,000 peak. We're not at record high prices. I say, yes, that's true, but it's also not the whole story, right? I wouldn't be an economist if I wasn't up here telling you that price is not the whole picture of farmer profitability. And I think a key difference of what we're seeing right now, in addition to that really extended tough spot in the ag economy of farmers' ability to weather this shock, is where commodity prices are at now. In 2022, you saw corn prices spike to about $8 a bushel, and we're really not seeing the same amount of support. Like I think Nick mentioned earlier, this is a net importer region of grains, whereas Russia and Ukraine were net exporters of wheat, corn, etc. So we're not seeing the same support there. So if I was sitting, on my couch or penciling out my balance sheet for the rest of the year, maybe some decisions that I have left to make in 2022 versus now, that equation is still pretty different. I think a really telling metric of comparing where we're at and how farmers, especially corn growers, are viewing that. If you're looking at where futures contracts are for NOLA urea FOB prices versus where that new crop corn price is, right now it takes about 145 bushels of corn to buy 1 ton of urea. In 2022, in April, that would be about 125 bushels, which is pretty, that sounds not as close. When you consider that the absolute price that $1,000 a ton urea price was nearly 50% higher than we're seeing right now. So when you look at the relationship between corn and what it's going to take to finance or cash flow the inputs for next year or this year, what we're seeing is not only increased prices, but decreased affordability for what folks are getting out of the ground and what they're putting in.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's obviously something we've been looking at as well. We have seen some increases in both corn and soybean prices. I would note that if you kind of look at futures market trends, new crop contracts for both for 2026, it's been actually a fairly consistent increase since the start or maybe mid-January of the year, and there didn't really seem to be any, notable blip or change in that around the outbreak of the conflict. So again, Russia-Ukraine was very different. We saw very direct impacts, additional increases in commodity prices that were driven there. Again, given the nature of the region and the fact that they're importers, arguably could even have kind of a negative demand impact. If it's more difficult to get some of those commodities shipped into that region. And so again, arguably could have a negative price impact, I think, in terms of prices. I did check this morning, Gary. I think we're around 490 new crop corn on the board. I want to say 1150 on soybeans. Some of the fall cash price bid opportunities, at least here in Central Illinois, are kind of in that 450, maybe 460 range in some places, and then 11 or a little bit better than $11 on soybeans. Those are better than what went into our crop budgets when we originally put them out last August and we updated them in January. Do you see that offsetting some of these cost increases we could see here even in the 2026 crop year?
So obviously 450 is better than 420. It's still below our break-even levels, so I don't see them necessarily offsetting anything that's going on in on the cost side. But 450 is better than 420, and I would also suggest that maybe is the time we start pricing some of that new crop out there, because even though it's not necessarily at break-even levels, it might be some of the higher prices that we see. Obviously, that depends a lot on what happens to weather going in and forward. And we're also looking at that March 30th report coming up here, see what that has to say.
We want to talk about that March 30 report. I do want to remind folks that if they have questions, of course, you can ask them. There is a question box. It's up in the right-hand corner, right up there. That you can just click. We'll see those questions come in. I was taking a quick look at some of the nearby lead option prices during the time frames you were talking about. So in April of 22, corn was at $8.20. By the time we got to the fall, and it fell all the way to $5.60 by the time we got to July, but it had recovered to around $6.50, I think, by August. I think the more worrisome one might be the 2023 version. So you had in April of 2023 something like $6.50 corn. By the time we got to the fall, that corn had dropped all the way down to the $4.80 area. So the question then, given we're at $4.50 now, what kind of downside do we have, or do we play that out where we are and the futures are actually correct at this point? I know that's hard for anybody to answer, but that's kind of what we're looking at. So I think the point, I guess, for all of you is that this is not a Russia-Ukraine kind of event, and that has to do a lot with the idea that first, it had a different impact on fertilizers and fuel out of Russia-Ukraine, but Russia-Ukraine was a primary export market for both wheat, primary for wheat, and for corn, I think number 4 maybe at the time, exporter for Ukraine. So looking forward, and so that was an interruption that held prices up. I don't know whether that will be the case this time around if people are thinking about this.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me to maybe get back to at least the way I interpreted some of Chuck's comments, and I'd like both Chuck and maybe Gretchen's reaction on this. But I kind of viewed what Chuck outlined in terms of U.S. position in terms of access. Fertilizers and any energy-based commodities are obviously global commodities, and so the price shocks translate to everybody. I think what a point that Chuck was making, or again, at least my interpretation, was kind of the silver lining, or maybe lipstick on a pig, would be another good analogy here, is that, U.S. farmers, at least while being facing higher prices, maybe the extent of that price increase isn't as large as producers in other parts of the world, like South America, where they may be more reliant on imported fertilizers, specifically from that Middle East region. And so, there might be an advantage that exists, but an advantage that becomes even larger, even though it's a challenging time for all farmers, given the increase in fertilizer prices. Would that be sort of an accurate way of thinking about that, Chuck?
Yeah, you were touching on some of the discussions I've been having. When we look at the conflict, of course, that takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room, and we all think about the conflict driving prices because of supply chain and transportation bottlenecks. There's also, what's amazing, some underlying demand. I was reminded that 34 countries approximately subsidize their fertilizer purchases for their farmers. So you think about that, do all the countries, and not all of them are direct and strong competitors of ours, but there are countries that do compete directly with us in a global market. And so that is a little bit interesting. They may be shielded in some countries from the run-up of fertilizer, but there's always, limiting factors with national budgets from all those countries as well. So they're not limitless in their ability to pay. The other thing we were finding interesting is, a country like Algeria is known for producing urea, and it decided to cut its urea production 50% because they could get a higher price for their natural gas than making fertilizer. Now, they may not be the end-all be-all for urea production, but what we're looking at here is my point, and I think you've helped illustrate it, is that competitive pressures globally for fertilizers, whether it be to agriculture or the input products that fertilizers are made from, the conflicts in Russia, Ukraine, the conflicts in Iran can have bidding, certainly strong competitive bidding and prices that are going up in other areas that find more fear in the premiums that are needed in the conflict because they're not as understanding. There is some discussions I was having. I didn't realize these are friendly discussions. Is the United States and North America very confident about what they are doing and how they're being able to navigate this conflict, and therefore not pricing themselves or bidding up as high as what other countries do because of the fear. I found those discussions intriguing. That go beyond what we usually see and just think of very narrowly. Can't get fertilizer through the Strait of Hormuz, therefore it goes up.
On the global side, and I was thinking about this and before the question came in, but we do have a question on Brazil and the impact there. Probably ought to take up Argentina. The two of you traveled to Brazil with Joanna Calusi. She was a member of the FarmDoc team now at Purdue, posted to the FarmDoc Daily website in the last 2 weeks, I think within the last week, suggesting that margins of profitability for soybean farmers there were just $10 per acre for this year. What impact do we suppose that the increase in both fuel and fertilizer prices will have on them? They'll be the next ones to actually plant a crop, a corn crop going in the ground now. Or
probably done.
And darn close to being done. And then, of course, in our fall, they'll be planting their next soybean crop.
Yeah, no, it's likely that all the crops are planted, or most of them are planted.
I think it was 95% last week.
Planted in Brazil. The next time they will begin to feel this is when they're going to begin planting for the next year, and they'll plant in late September, early October, begin planting soybeans and other crops. But Brazil is much more reliant on imports of fertilizers than the United States, so they will have probably more elevated prices than we do. Whether that translates into lower production there, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the timing, again, relative positives here for them is probably better than it could be because of their main corn growing season, cotton growing season as well, particularly in the center west. Planning's kind of wrapped up, probably not as impacted by these price hikes as they would have been had it happened a few months earlier. And then, soybeans being the main crop they'll plant in the fall, not as an intensive of a fertilized crop as corn or cotton. But they are much more exposed to all the fertilizer products that they use for all the crops that they produce, just because of their significantly higher import reliance relative to here in the U.S.
So I got a question. So Gretchen, I got a question for Gretchen here that sort of plays off of that. Gretchen, you noted that fertilizer prices were pretty strong before this whole thing. What do you attribute? What was your attributing that to, and was there anything suggestions that resulted from that?
Ooh, opening a can of worms here. I think globally we've seen prices high since 2022. We haven't seen a lot of relief ever since they came up, right? And that's been consistent globally, depending on, India is a really big buyer, especially of nitrogen. We've got, your southern hemisphere growers. And so this past year, there's been a lot. You still have some knock-on effects of Russia-Ukraine energy prices. You had some export bans on China. They're a really big producer and consumer of fertilizer export as well. And so that can have an impact on the global market. You had some tariff reorienting. And then in the United States, you've had some other things, plant closures or maybe delays in bringing plants online, especially on some of that ammonia production. So it has been a really tight demand supply situation for quite a few years. As we've seen fertilizer consumption increase, but production be a little bit more constrained. And like we've talked about, this is a global commodity, so it's going to track, right? You have one hold up, it's going to keep going. The question of where do we turn next or what are solutions is really interesting. People are turning over stones, especially to look for nitrogen right now. And there are not a lot of taps that can be turned on there. The comment about Algeria was interesting in the LNG. I know that India has made some choices about how they're going to use their natural gas and how, they're going to get fertilizer. That's a really, like you said, protected industry and input there. So, you have Russia, they're producing a lot of really low cost relatively, but that's obviously a different can of worms. You have Europe is a really interesting case. They stopped purchasing natural gas from Russia, and they have a carbon border adjustment mechanism that just went into place in January. So watching to see how they're going to get affordable fertilizer to their farmers is really curious. But it's tough because there's not a lot of we've been consuming a lot really close to that supply-demand relationship already. And so there are very few places that have excess fertilizer that they are willing to put on the global market right now.
Chuck, I have a quick question for you related to the movement and distribution of fertilizers through the GROWMARK system or just across the United States. AFBF, or the American Farm Bureau Federation, made note that only 18% of the nitrogen is imported from outside of the United States. Still, most of it, even if it's produced here, I believe comes from the New Orleans area and has to be distributed. What impact does fuel have on that distribution and in terms of price and how it gets moved?
Yes, it can. And you think about it from the standpoint of the percentage of the actual cost of the input. And we still see anhydrous ammonia through pipelines in a number of locations, so that's helpful and a low cost. But then we have I know that even the pressures in the mid-south, or the mid-south here of the United States, where they do apply anhydrous ammonia, we were experiencing some lines at terminals this week, 2 to 3 hours. What's the point there? Well, your fuel costs, you don't idle the truck the whole time this time of year, but you still have to be sitting there waiting in line. And then where are you going to be pulling and pushing that nitrogen product through? You're also right when you say 18%. One of the things that we think about is there's areas of the country that are not as easy to get fertilizers to in an efficient fashion. So therefore, your fuel price would come into play. If you have to truck it a long distance, that's going to be an enhanced cost that goes into that product. And that's where imports do play a role, because everything, as you just mentioned, in a global market has an impact here and there. So if we're not getting a good supply on the East Coast, then where is the East Coast going to get their supply? And is it domestically that then pulls away products from the Midwest? And I know that in the fuels marketplace, we were talking about that very issue yesterday, because some of the diesel needed to move from Ohio to get to the East Coast. Then that was meaning that while we are above our last year's total supply of liquid fuels in the Midwest, we're just below the 5-year rolling average of liquid fuel stocks. And then the East Coast is a little bit shorter. So you have these pulls that have these very specific impacts to given regions. And, they're going to be more spot specific than anything. But I think your question has a fundamental value in asking, and particularly in the overall economics of our North American input prices overall.
Okay, so Gary, when you think about all of this put together in the crop budgets, what do you see for this year, and what are your concerns as it's related to next year for corn production?
Yeah. So just to give you a feel, there's a $20 to $24 of cost in fuel in our budgets, and that's when you put it on a cash rent basis, there's $1,000 of total cost roughly. So 24, and you could see that going up to 30, I would guess, this year. The fertilizer I would expect to be pretty muted. I mean, most of the DAP and potash are probably on already. Then we get in how much of the nitrogen isn't priced at this point. And this is not a scientific survey, but we would guess. A bunch of old guys were sitting around guessing, and we thought 20% wasn't. So you take that for what it's worth. So there will be an increase there. What will be interesting to see is what actually happens to drying costs this fall. Natural gas hasn't moved up a lot in this country, primarily because we got a good market here, and those natural gas markets are a bit more insulated. So who knows? And that will also depend on the wetness of the crop coming off. The larger question is what happens in 2027. And again, I think you're going to see elevated fertilizer prices. And Chuck may I don't know if Chuck or Gretchen disagree with that, but elevated prices. But I think this also turns on a general price inflation. I mean, fuels tend to work that way.
Yeah, the important part is price inflation for inputs, but for the price of the grain or the output?
Muted at best.
Yeah.
Muted at best. I mean, maybe this is bigger than we think. Maybe Brazil cuts some. I can't imagine them cutting, but maybe the growth slows, and maybe we have a lot of this is going to depend on supply again, or what the growing conditions look like. And the March 30th report on acre planting intentions will be informative as well.
Gretchen, I want to ask you about that, but before I let you go on this, MRTN, important to follow, probably could pick up.
Yeah,
what?
this is
the perfect spot for that. You could pick up what, 10%?
Yeah. No, I mean the other thing is P and K levels. You know, P and K. Look at those P and K soil levels. Whenever I see them and see farmers results, I see those significantly above maintenance levels. So you can bring those P and K levels down some, and yeah, this is the time.
and then use the nitrogen rate calculator, or MRTN, probably going to tell you a lower pounds of N than you're already using, so you can make that go further.
170 and 180 pounds in northern and central Illinois. Southern Illinois is a bit higher at 200 pounds of N.
And that's all told. So that's DAP, MAP, anhydrous, urea, 28, all told in pounds. So it's calculated that way. On next Tuesday's report, March 31, USDA will release both grain stocks numbers and its prospective plantings report, Gretchen. Most are at that 85 million acres for soybeans, 94 million acres for corn. Where are you standing today?
Ooh, if you would have asked me this question a couple weeks ago, I would have had a definite answer for you. I think so. The prospective plantings report, when USDA sends that out, is the beginning of March, right? And so a lot happened at the beginning of March for that corn soybean price ratio, where that's going to land, and profitability in corn. So I don't know if I'll put a definite number on it, because it's hard to know, especially with that USDA 94 million number, right? Of like, if farmers would have changed, or if they had changed from that March 31st planting number. And so I think that maybe that report is going to offer us a little bit less clarity than we would normally see. But definitely, folks, until we get stuff in the field, I am still kind of anybody's ball game. But I have some hunches, and something I've been reminding folks is a lot of corn farmers do have their inputs already in hand. But when we're talking a 98.8 million acre year like last year, even some small changes can have really big effects, cumulative at the national level. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of farmers changing their minds or making different decisions about what they're applying or what they're putting in the ground to have a different aggregate number.
So, Jim, I'll turn to you. You do farm, if I remember correctly. Is that right? And what do you think the farmer's perspective on this is?
I talked to a number of folks last night, and they're not going to change. I mean, the number of acres that they have on the docket, the number of acres that they have budgeted for, is the number of the acres that's going to go in the ground. So in north central Illinois, I made some calls yesterday asking that very question, and that was the consensus of the group. Getting back to something that Gary said a minute ago, the 20% unpriced number, we went through retailers yesterday, and that was the exact number that we got back, was 20%. Everybody's about 80% purchased, and that 20% number, you hit it right on the head.
Yeah. So can you talk about the collection of the data that you do very briefly, and how that's done?
Sure. It is at one time, and there's still a part and a piece of this, but at one time it was done via the phone. The reporters would actually pick up the phone, take the bids, make the calls, record it, and then do the analysis on the backside. As things have progressed, we do it via email now. And as we get into times like we have been in the last month or so, we make sure that we get as many calls in and as many emails back as we possibly can to ensure that one data is right and we're getting the biggest spread of bids that we possibly can get. So it was at one time rather time intensive. The USDA has put together a new part of their reporting system now that makes it a little bit easier. Some of the calculations every once in a while seem a little different, but they have a tendency to balance out as we go on down the road. So we look at those numbers, and it's amazing the interest in that report. Universities across the country use it. Presentations are built from it. Conferences have breakout sessions using the data from that report. So it's something that we take pretty seriously, and we provide an extra attention to detail, if you will, going into that report.
No, it's obviously something that we rely on, and I do. It is interesting, the ranges that you report, but also something that gives it credibility in my mind is the relationship it typically has between Bloomberg's urea and anhydrous ammonia prices at New Orleans. The make there seems to make sense, and so I think that's a highly credible source of those prices, with the caveat that there's a lot of variability out there. Even there's just a lot of variability.
Yeah, and I would actually add on that, one thing I've been a little bit surprised on, and again, we only have, 2 reports worth of information since the conflict started, but, that range can be wide, but the ranges we've seen in the last 2 reports aren't as big as a lot of the ranges we saw for a pretty long time period during that Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, or the beginnings of that, obviously still ongoing there, but, that's not to say that those ranges won't widen up in the next few reports. But yeah, I mean, it's common to see $100 ranges there on some of those prices. A lot of times we'll get comments back that those prices are wrong, and I'd like to defend Jim here. They're not wrong. It's just the nature of averages. A lot of times the average doesn't apply to any individual because it's a collection of prices below and above that. But yeah, everything we see in that report, it's widely used and really good information. So we did get a question here, and I think it's sort of been addressed, but I just wanted to sort of reiterate it here. We had a question on whether some of these high fertilizer costs might negatively impact crop yields, and I suppose you could think about that from a U.S. or overall kind of global perspective. I think we've touched on that. Again, I wouldn't expect any lower fertilizer rate driven yield declines in the U.S. And we had someone comment here. They didn't see this question, but they provided this information. Somebody who maybe seems to maybe be more in touch with the Brazilian situation. And they don't foresee a reduction here. Again, I think the timing again on that is really key. With the majority of inputs probably priced for the corn crop here in the U.S. as well as the corn crop that's pretty much in the ground now in Brazil. I don't think there's going to be yield impacts due to that. Obviously, weather could still lead to below trend yields in either area, but I don't think it'll be a fertilizer driven story. Gary, I don't know if you agree with that.
I would agree with that. What's going to determine it at this point is weather, and as is usually the case.
Well, we've had a weird March. I know this week both you and I were on the road, different parts of the state, and I can tell you between here and Western Illinois, there was quite a bit of looked like anhydrous being applied, and even some tillage work going on Monday. And you were up in DeKalb on Tuesday.
Yeah.
So,
and saw my first planter running yesterday.
There were some planting intentions at the meeting I was at on Monday that some beans were going to go on the ground in West Central Illinois still this week. So
yeah, and just the weather. I wore a sweater today. I should not have, and I'll have to remember to wear it tomorrow because I think
you will.
Think I'm gonna need that there.
We reached the top of the hour, the end of our program. Chuck, Gretchen, or Jim, do any of you have anything that you'd like to add, a final point that you'd like to make? Seeing none, thank you all. I appreciate it. And Chuck Spencer is with GROWMARK. Gretchen Kuck is with the National Corn Growers Association. And Jim Raftis is with the Illinois Department of Agriculture. He's with NASS, actually, and AMS, the part of USDA. We thank all of them. We would like to thank our sponsors as well for the day. They include the TIA Center for Farmland Research, CoBank, Compeer Financial, Farm Credit, FS GROWMARK, the Illinois Corn Growers Association, Illinois Soybean Association, and John Deere, along with our FarmDoc educational partners. They include, of course, the College of ACES, that's Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, University of Illinois Extension, FBFM, or the Farm Business Farm Management Team, the Gardner Agricultural Policy Program as well. If you'd like to see this program again, you can do that easily enough. It'll be up online at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu in the archive section. Look under webinars and events, you'll find it there. Or you can easily enough go to YouTube and look for it at youtube.com/@farmdoc. Thank you to Nick Paulson and to Gary Schnitkey for joining us. You have a great day. I'm University of Illinois Extension farm broadcaster Todd Gleason. Oh, and thanks to Jim Boltz as well, who's behind the scenes.